Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Magic, Myth, and More panel. My name is Marlene Harris, and I'm one of the science fiction and fantasy columnists at Library Journal, and I'll be moderating this session, Magic, Myth, and More, which has a lot to do with one half of that equation from Library Journal, and just a little bit to do with the other half as well. I'm excited to welcome the following authors and their books. First up, Mateo Askaripour with his This Great Hemisphere, published by Dutton. It's set in a not so horribly distant future, even if some things are horrible. A future that's engineered to be a dystopia, that keeps its dominant population in line because it's created an underclass of second-class citizens for everybody to hate. Those second-class citizens are born invisible, and it focuses its story on one brilliant invisible who is determined to change the rules that keep her and her people down by getting on the inside, only to learn that a quiet rebellion is exactly what the powers that be wanted all along. Second, Paolo Bacigalupi's Navola, which could be simply described as Machiavelli's Renaissance Italy with deadly politics, magic, and dragons. But of course, nothing that starts out with its description using Machiavelli could be nearly that simple, but it could be, and is, sharp as a dagger from beginning to end. And I'd really love it if everybody started coming back on. Fear the Flames by Olivia Rose Darling, published by Delacorte, is an epic fantasy with big romantic vibes centered around a curse that might be a blessing, a deadly self-fulfilling prophecy, a lost kingdom, kidnapped dragons, and a woman determined to protect everything that's hers and deliver the revenge they have coming to a whole lot of people who seriously deserve it. Lady Macbeth by Reid, published by Del Rey, tells the story not of the protagonist of the Scottish play, because we already know how that works, but rather it takes that familiar tale, sets it back in something like its true historical context, and then tells it from the perspective of a young, naive, very much stranger in this very strange land, Lady Macbeth, and tells the story of her survival against all odds, including her own. And then last but not least, KX Song's The Night Ends with Fire, published by Ace, a fantasy retelling of the story of the twice Disney-fied heroine Mulan, this time called Mei Lin, as she wrenches the reins of her own destiny out of the hands of her opium-addled father by pretending to be a man, enlisting in the army, and finding her dragon. So now that that's out of the way and everybody's joined me, I'm going to start, first things first. We're going to talk about what's at the center of each of your stories. So first up, Ava and then KX, your stories are based on somewhat on at least partially familiar material, on stories and characters that we already think we know. Mulan in the case of The Night Ends with Fire, and of course, Lady Macbeth in the book that's named for her. What did you hope to explore, or what did you hope to have readers learn, or both, in using these characters to put a different spin or perspective on stories many readers will come in with preconceived notions of? Ava, let's start with you.
Yeah, so it was very intimidating to take on a character like Lady Macbeth, because she's had so many different iterations and interpretations over time. Not only do you have Shakespeare's original play, but you also have the actual historical figure that she was based on, because Macbeth was a real person and he had a real wife named Gruach. And I think what was important for me was to find kind of my own way into the story. Like, why am I writing this? Why am I trying to enter something into this like very long and kind of illustrious canon of Shakespeare adaptations? And I thought a lot about kind of how to do that, because like it's one thing to say, oh, I'm writing a feminist retelling, but like what does that really mean, and how is mine, how am I setting mine apart? And I kind of found my way into that by reading works from actual medieval female authors, like Marie de France. So I ended up incorporating kind of a lot of those like themes and motifs and symbols into Lady Macbeth and my version of the story because I wanted it to kind of feel like, you know, this is a real character and this is the way that a young medieval woman would be telling her story because this is the kind of literature she would be reading and she would be, you know, incorporating these elements into her own kind of imagining of her life. And that was kind of my way also of doing this kind of like meta acknowledgement of like, my story is just one version of this character. Like Lady Macbeth in my book is more like a title or like a cloak, figuratively and literally, that my character wears. I don't know. I just felt like it was important to kind of acknowledge that, like, this is just one iteration of a story and a character that is so well known and so famous and so important to so many people as like a feminist icon.
Thank you. KX, your Maylin as opposed to Milan. How did
Yes, it's a great question. And I think that I was inspired by multiple sources. So I loved the 1998 animated classic growing up and just found it a really fun adventure story. That being said, I did find it a bit interesting at the end of the film, where, spoilers, Mulan gains all these powers, you know, saves the kingdom from war and devastation, and then comes home and is content to return to her ways of womanhood. And interestingly, there is a Chinese version of the classic in which it's a little bit not as happy as the Disney version, but essentially Mulan is supposed to be sent as a concubine to an enemy emperor, and instead of desecrating herself in this way, she sacrifices herself to remain pure. In both instances, she is motivated by filial piety and honor to her kingdom. And I found it a little bit interesting, especially as an adult, that this woman in history who has gained so much power and prestige and also fame in her own ways would then be content to go back to her life as, you know, a woman in a combined society where women are treated as second-class citizens. And so I was curious about exploring that dichotomy and looking more into what would a woman in those, you know, ancient times, given this power, how would it change her, and how would it change the trajectory of her ambition and how she sees her own future?
wow. Not that any real inspirational source for pretty much anything ends as happily as the Disney version, because that just doesn't happen. Okay, moving from people we think we know to people we become acquainted with in the story. Paolo and then Olivia, your stories, very much on the other hand, focus their stories on familiar types of characters that inhabit your very intricately created epic fantasy worlds. In both cases, your characters are heirs to powerful kingdom, although in the case of Navola, kingdom isn't exactly the right word, but the idea of it anyway. Navigating through some truly epic political shenanigans, needing to take or make names for themselves and claim or reclaim their heritage. What made these worlds the best places to tell the stories you wanted to tell? And what was it about these fledgling characters that made them the right people to hang those stories on?
So with my main character, he's Daviko de Regula de Navola, and he is the heir to a powerful merchant banking family. And he the thing that was interesting to me, I guess I already was interested in sort of Renaissance banking. A friend of mine had given me a book years ago called Medici Money, and it was all about sort of like the nascent banking industry and how, you know, everything from letters of credit to insurance started getting built, and so those things were in my mind already. But with Daviko, I was interested in the idea of someone who is meant to inherit power. I was interested in dynastic dynamics, and it's, you know, at some point you can have a sequence of people who are very successful in a dynasty, and at some point you're going to come across a weak link. And I was really interested in the idea of a character who's supposed to inherit a great deal of power and responsibility, where the stakes are real, and that person might not be fully equipped for the tasks that they have to face, and that would matter, and that's not a strength or any kind of thing. It's actually critical, both to Daviko and his family, that he succeed, even when he's perhaps a little too soft and a little too trusting for the role he has to play.
Olivia? Speaking of characters who are not soft.
Yeah, Elowen's not exactly soft, but she actually existed before my world existed. Like one day she just came into my head and then she just never left. And I just really knew I needed to write her story. So the way that I kind of built the world, especially through my first draft, was I was building it through Elowen's eyes. And I would kind of learn the world as she would learn the world because she's living in exile since she's a child and she's kind of removed from the world. So I wanted to kind of learn it through her eyes as she is, you know, becoming a more developed character. And then the world develops because she goes out of this hidden kingdom and she really wants to get her dragons back. And her personality traits also really helped me develop the story because she knows what she wants, she knows what she deserves, and she knows she's going to get it. Like she wants her dragons back, she's going to free them, and she'll do whatever it takes to get to them. And she has a lot of weight on her shoulders, but she still never really lost her kindness, which is also something that I really enjoyed writing. So I would say that like the world was the perfect place for her because the story doesn't really exist without her, and I needed to bring her to life through the pages.
Okay. Mateo, your story is a bit of an outlier in this group, in that your story is more dystopian and science fictional instead of fantasy. But for all of the SF aspects of your world, what sets your protagonist and her people apart is that she's invisible, which feels like a bit of magical realism in this SF setting. Mm. Why invisibility? What made that the right vehicle for the story?
Yeah, Marlene, I feel like the stepchild here. I'm joking. You said I'm the ally. I'm joking. Everyone got paired up except me. No, I'm happy.
Sometimes it goes a different way, but
yeah, you're right. No, I'm happy to be here. Thanks everyone for showing up. These are some incredible books. My God. Yeah, so Sweet Mint, also known as Candace, this book is set 500 years in the future. A large portion, but not the majority of the population is invisible, literally see-through. It's none of that like shimmery skin in the sunlight type stuff. They're literally see-through. And this Marlene and everyone here was born out of an experience that I actually had, not where I suddenly became invisible and people were like, Mateo, where'd you go? More so, I was on the subway, the dirty, nasty New York City subway, and I was sitting there, and a man comes on with his wife, and he asks her, who I presume to be his wife, he asks her, you know, where do you want to sit? And he just points directly at my chest, and I'm looking around, and I'm like, wait, like he's asking her if she wants to sit where I'm sitting, and they walk over and I'm getting ready for one of them to sit on my lap in a way that I wouldn't enjoy. And eventually they just sort of cram into like the half seat next to me uncomfortably and shift and shuffle. And when I went back home that night, I felt strange. I was wondering, did they really think that I was invisible? Did they not see me? What's going on here? And I started to feel this sense of, you know, almost powerlessness, right? And then I started just to play around with my head, like a lot of the authors here, I'm sure, right? We just start doing daydreaming, brainstorming, asking questions. And I said, well, what if there were actually a real race of people who were invisible? How did they become invisible? Are all the people who aren't invisible in awe of them? Do they revere them as gods, or are they more so driven to subjugate and potentially annihilate them because they're different? And then characters started to form, settings started to form. And as the months went on, I started adding more and more to this invisible note that I had on my phone. And eventually I began this novel. And as I was writing the novel, I realized that invisibility is just a metaphor for how so many of us feel today in so many different ways. And as I was writing, I began to look around in the streets of New York City and in other places and notice how so many people went unnoticed. because they were in service, they were in retail or something like that. And then when I began to discuss this book more with my mother and my family, I started to hear all these stories of invisibility. So invisibility is something made real and concrete in this novel, but I think it's something that unfortunately many people will be able to relate to. And KX used a word or a phrase that I've been thinking about a lot when discussing this novel, which is, what does it mean to be a second-class citizen in the country that you were born and raised in?
Well, Mateo, you're going to be the stepchild again for the next question. I'm sorry, but that's the way it worked out.
As long as I still get my Christmas gifts, then we're
Yeah.
good. Yeah,
You
okay.
just don't have any dragons.
Yeah, I know, none of that, but I like it.
But we are gonna talk about monsters, and you have definitely got some of those in that story. I think you've got the biggest one of all. But we're gonna talk about monsters and villains and dragons, which are absolutely not the same thing in any of these stories, whether there are actual dragons present or not. So I'm going to start with Olivia, and everybody's going to get hit up next in this one. All of your stories feature dragons, but never as monsters. No matter how much some of the other characters in your story, I'm thinking of Olivia's story in particular, try to make them be monsters. Also in Lady Macbeth, come to think of it. But which leads to my question of why dragons? What is it about dragons that made, and I've got to stop pounding my desk while I talk. What is it about dragons that made each of you choose to use them as foils for the monstrosity of humans instead of letting them be the monsters themselves? So,
Sorry.
yes, you.
Okay, so first of all, I grew up on How to Train Your Dragon, so automatically I've always loved dragons. Like I grew up with the coloring books, the action figures, all of it. So I've always loved them. I've never really viewed them as monsters, even though that they definitely have the potential to be monsters. And I think it's also very much about perspective, because I write in Elowen's point of view, and Elowen would absolutely never view her dragons as monsters. And with like how you mentioned other characters view them as monsters, other characters also view Elowen as a monster. So just because someone says that something or someone is monstrous doesn't necessarily make it so, because with Elowen, there's so many people that would say like, oh, like she murders people, like she's a bad person. But, it also has to do with circumstances that she's living in and all of that. So she loves her dragons, so we love her dragons.
Before I move on to the next person, I have to tell you, I came about this close to asking a question about, on a scale of 1 to 10, with Smog being 1 and Toothless being 10, where your dragons fall.
Oh, I would have to say they're definitely closer to Toothless for sure, because they're very playful. I sometimes think of them as oversized fire-breathing puppies. I would say that they're about like an 8.5 on the Toothless scale, just because they do have that like feisty side. So not a full Toothless, but very much closer to Toothless.
And now that we've done that, Paolo?
Yeah, so this novel actually started out as sort of a thought experiment because a friend of mine was doing an anthology about dragons, and he asked me if I'd be willing to write anything about dragons, and I was like, yeah, I haven't never done anything like that. That sounds like kind of a fun thing to try. At the time, I wasn't writing very much anymore. I'd sort of quit writing for the most part. And I started fiddling around with what I would do with dragons and what was interesting to me about dragons. And I ended up the dragon. The first line of Navola is, "My father kept a dragon eye on his desk." And it's this fossil. It's this fossilized dragon eye that looks sort of like a comet. It's got all these like sort of trailing optical nerves that have fossilized and stuff. And it's still sort of alive. Its soul is sort of trapped inside of it. And when I was working on this story, I was really interested in a lot of different things, and one of them was the relationship of human beings with nature. I ended up building an entire mythology around that, and one of the gods that people worship is Virga, and she's said to have woven the world. And so those things that are most close to nature are part of the weave. And in their mythology, human beings have fallen out of the weave. They're part of something called cambios, that which changes, as opposed to the firmos, which is that which is firm and solid and part of the weave. And the dragon is very much part of the weave. And as such, it's an apex predator. It's the thing that eats other things. It's not malicious, as we often times depict dragons, but it is hungry. And it hunts, and it's unapologetic about that. That's its nature. And so there was an interesting sort of possibility of playing with the idea of this hunger, of this connection to the larger natural world, where not with malice, but you consume things, and you're part of this entire weave of connections, with nature and things like that. And then Daviko, being this young, fairly naive young boy, being exposed to that, coming across this eye where he's fairly soft and he's part of cambios, he's part of the human world, and coming into contact with that natural world, which is both can be beautiful and extraordinary and interconnected, but also dangerous.
KX, you're up next.
I love all these variations of dragons. My variation is based off of Chinese mythology. So there are these 4 mythological creatures who are based off of and represent the 4 seasons, the 4 directions, 4 elements. And they are the dragon, the phoenix, the tiger, and the tortoise. And I was also curious about examining what is the cost of obtaining this power, and also how does this power change you once you have it? And what I love about fantasy is that it allows you to explore these very theoretical questions in tangible ways. And so I tied each mythological creature and the harnessing of their power to a dark human emotion. And so Marlene has the power of the dragon, and the dragon feeds off of human greed or human ambition. And so as she utilizes this power more and more, it also feeds on her ambition and her hunger for power.
And Ava, Lady Macbeth the play doesn't have a dragon in it, but you do.
Yeah, this is an adult panel, right? So
Yes.
like I can be a little PG-13, and anyone who's read my book will understand why I'm saying that. Yeah, so basically, like, arguably one of Lady Macbeth's most famous lines in the play is that look the innocent flower and be the serpent beneath it, right? So obviously it's not too much of a stretch to get from serpent to dragon, especially writing in this like high medieval European fantasy setting. And so the serpent, and then by extension the dragon, in my book represents essentially some part of Lady Macbeth's identity that needs to be kind of kept concealed. And my Lady Macbeth, Roskilde, is this very like cerebral character, and she prides herself on having this like very clever, strategic mind, and her desire in some sense is to almost like be pure mind, to almost like disavow herself of a physical form entirely, particularly when her body becomes the site of misogynistic violence and trauma. And the dragon, who is also the love interest, because at the end of the day, this is a monster fucking book, it becomes like, I'm sorry, I warned you all. Yeah, it is symbolic of her very like embodied desires, these desires that she tries to kind of subdue. It's like her visceral wants and her needs seem monstrous to her, which I think is something many women are made to feel and can relate to. So Lysander, the love interest, the dragon, he almost functions more as like an extension of her than like his own character, because he's like this epitomized form of like her sexuality and her freedom and her like bodily autonomy.
Stepchild.
Yes, mother.
While your story doesn't have any actual dragons, it could sure as hell be argued that Kroger Ten Masse is the biggest monster of them all.
Mm.
The system he's created and perpetuates has monsterized all of the individuals, all of the invisibles. But he's the one who's really monstrous.
Mm.
My question is, what does he represent, or maybe better put, how much does he represent of the way their world works and the way our world works too?
Yeah, that's a great one. I feel like I could say there are dragons in my book too, but they're just invisible. Sort of what J.K. Rowling likes to do, with reverse engineering characters. But no, there aren't any dragons. But Kroger Tenmace for people here, right, is the biggest inventor in the land of the Northwestern Hemisphere, which is where the majority of this great hemisphere takes place. He takes a young invisible woman, again Sweetman, also known as Candace, under his guidance. She's a prodigy of sorts, and she had lost, or her brother had disappeared 3 years prior to when the book opens up. And while she's still grieving, she again gains this apprenticeship with the premier inventor of the land. um, Olivia said something earlier to the tune of, not all monsters are monstrous, and monsters come in all shapes and sizes. And for someone like Kroger Tenmace, who has engineered the Northwestern Hemisphere behind the scenes, so much so that he's sometimes referred to as the great architect or the great engineer, he does not view himself as a monster. This is a tangent of sorts, but it's related, I promise. I just finished watching the OJ Simpson 30 for 30 documentary that came out in 2016. I never watched it. It's on Netflix for anyone who has some time and wants to watch that. Very difficult to watch, but the thing about it is that, from the first episode to the fifth, at no point did he ever view himself as a monster. He said, I'm OJ. Everyone loves me. Come on, I'm the juice. And I just thought how wild and surreal it was that from beginning to end, he not only, maintained his innocence, that's to be expected, but maintained this moralistic high ground that I am a good person. So in that same vein, you have many of these characters, including Kroger Tenmace, who does not view himself as a monster in any way. He views himself as the vanguard of progress, as someone who is doing what needs to be done in order to engender a better world. But what I'm trying to show in this novel, and as we've seen throughout history, is that better for some means worse for others. And it's all incredibly relative. And as those who have very warped views of the world and how the world should be gain power, it means the subjugation and oppression for so many other people. So this is a speculative novel, but Marlene, I also view it as historical fiction because it's set on the foundation of things that we've already seen and are repeating and perhaps will continue to repeat. But if history is cyclical, I then want the reader to ask, what, if anything, can I do to disrupt that cycle?
Which is what Sweetman thinks she's going to do. And yeah, her hopes may not be realized, but it is something that you get left with. Okay, moving along from something deep to something that possibly may go even deeper. Starting with KX and Ava, both of your stories are set in historical settings or quasi-historical settings where men had all the power and women were supposed to be submissive and obedient, or that's what popular image says. But your stories are both female-led and female-centric. Are they also intended to be feminist interpretations? Because those aren't necessarily the same thing. So, KX?
Yes and no. I think that in terms of coming up with a story, I'm very character first and theme second. And so I set out to write this character who I thought was sort of driven by her selfish ambition and her need for power in that sense. At the same time, I did feel like in Chinese history, which is very vast, we have 5,000 years, many dynasties, there are women who strike very powerful figureheads in history. And oftentimes the retelling feels a little bit skewed or warped in terms of why are these details left out? What does that say that this emperor would always go to his concubine before making any major decision? And why is that? Why are we not focusing on that detail? Because we're trying to tell a different version of history. And so that was something that motivated me in this. How does history shift with every retelling? And also, how does history change the way that we view our collective memory? The other source that inspired me was actually this Chinese classic called Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And I love the story so much. It's been adapted many, many times into TV shows, movies, etc. And growing up, I used to watch the TV show with my grandfather and would play act a lot of the scenes. There is political intrigue, there is epic scale, plot twist, betrayal, giant war scenes. And I wanted to put in those themes and those elements that I loved into this book. But at the same time, I wanted to also change what I didn't love. And what I didn't love is that these volumes are epic by nature. There are over hundreds of characters in the books. And yet the only women in the books are either villains or useless damsels in distress. And so I wanted to subvert that a bit and explore the ways in which women are actually in the behind the stage, manipulating some of the strings that are integral for determining the fate of the kingdom itself.
Ava?
Yeah, I'm kind of the opposite in that I'm like theme first and then character and then setting and all follows after that. And I think with a character like Lady Macbeth, like the feminist reading of her is so important to so many people. That's almost like the first thing you have to kind of contend with when you're trying to tell her story. Like she looms very large in kind of our minds as like a feminist figure. And that's obviously something that I try to like honor and take into account. And like I don't know if this is maybe like me just having like gothic brain rot, but I always found something like very disturbing about the fact that she's the only like female character in the play with like an actual name, and like she's just surrounded by men in this like remote castle. And like I don't know, that always just like evoked like this very like uncomfortable emotion in me, especially because we know her fate. And there's so many like different directions you can go with this because we learn so little about her. We don't learn any of her backstory. We don't even know her like first name. So it was like challenging, but also really fun and interesting to create what I hope is a very complex character with these complex relationships to womanhood and identity and sexuality, because that's so much the core of what like the popular conception of the character is.
And before I keep going, we're at like 2/3 through, and anybody who is out there who has questions for any of the authors, please put them in the Q&A screen. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking to each other. Mateo, see, you're not last.
Thank you.
This great hemisphere is in the speculative fiction tradition of exploring social justice issues by creating a new group to other instead of hanging it on something that exists. And then by setting the story away from now, either in time or place or both. Is that what you set out to do, or is that what the story your characters wanted to tell?
Ooh.
I struggled with these writing them, so it's only fair that you guys struggle with
I
answering.
hear you. So is the question about, trying to create a new group of others, or is it more so about the time that it was set?
Well, it's both, because there is a long tradition in speculative fiction about wanting to talk about how terrible, in some ways, how conditions in the present that are less than stellar,
Yeah.
but getting it through, a lot of people's filters.
Yeah.
And was that intentional, or is that just what happened because that's the way the characters wanted to go?
Oh yeah, 100%. It was both. When I write a novel, it feels as though sort of like I am creating a scenario where I'm having the characters say, go run and play, and then they end up being the boss. So it was both of those things. I did want to present the reality of oppression, but not only just oppression, ambition, adventure, siblinghood, love, in ways that were familiar, but also in an unfamiliar setting. Right. With something like my first novel, Black Buck, it was the same, where there's a lot of humor, but there's also an extreme amount of reality once you get beyond that humor. And at no point am I looking to hide behind anything. With my first book, I wasn't looking to hide behind satire. With this book, I'm not looking to hide behind the speculative nature. So if and when people read it, they're going to see some very clear allusions to what's happening today. I didn't feel as though I needed or wanted to make use of nuance in certain instances because I wanted it to be clear without the shadow of a doubt of what I was presenting, while at the same time being in this environment that is new, that is hopefully rich and vivid with detail, and that is also hopefully not plagued with a bunch of tragedy and trauma and doom and gloom. Because to give humanity to these invisible people, to these people who have felt as though they've been second-class citizens within their world or their hemisphere, meant giving them levity and joy and laughter at the same time. Otherwise, despite this being speculative, it would have felt inauthentic and dishonest.
Thank you. Olivia, Fear the Flames, very much romantasy, which means a combination of romance and an epic fantasy. Which came first for you? Was it the romance, or was it the world building? And how do you feel about the way those two things blended together?
So for me, actually, it was the friendship that came first, because one of the really important themes in Fear the Flames is friendship. And it's, I mean, it's a very, like, I guess, love-based novel, because there's so many different forms of love, like, you know, romantic, platonic. And I think that they're both equally important, and they both really drive the story. And I always knew that I really wanted to write a book with, like, a group of characters that have, like, all kinds of issues. They have, like, mommy issues, daddy issues, issues in general. Like, they're traumatized, and they just come together and they form a family of some kind, more like a gang, but a family. And you know, they're there for each other. They're gonna steal stuff together, and the romance just, like, blended in there effortlessly, because it's almost like I was witnessing, like, a friend group teasing their friends, like, about a budding romance between two of them, and, like, they're like, oh my God, get together, guys. So it kind of all just really flowed together. So I guess I would say, like, the romance came first, but just, like, more like love, like, just love in general.
I'm going to start shortening things because we only have 10 minutes left. That's insane. But Paolo, were you intending to write what could be classified as a gateway drug for historical fiction readers to get into fantasy, or did that just happen organically?
Yeah, it was organic. I started with that first line, and I started with this feeling of like, okay, I want to write about this dragon eye. I want to write about this powerful father figure. I want to write about this kid who's observing his father. And I'd already been reading, you know, things like Medici Money, and there were some other books about the Italian Renaissance that I've been reading. I've been reading a lot about like this sort of process of rediscovery of old texts in Renaissance Italy, and the active sort of excavation of old knowledge, both from Roman and Greek times, and there was something alive about that, and so then that sort of formed a framework for me to work from, where it was like, okay, I want to play with all of these ideas. I like these ideas of these, you know, incredibly powerful banking families. They don't actually have like a physical, you know, army or seat of power, and yet they're massively influential. And then there's all of these other layers of like philosophy and like architecture and mathematics, and all of those things are going on. All of this stuff with art, and also like just the idea of all of these complex city states sort of vying against each other, and then on top of that, these really larger than life characters, whether it's the Medici, or whether it's the Borgia, or whether it's, you know, Machiavelli or Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci. You have these just so many people who are doing interesting things, and yet, like, if you work on that in a historical context, you're trapped. And And I didn't want to be trapped. I wanted to steal all of the things that were fun about any of these given aspects and play with them for myself, and turn those stories in the directions that were most intriguing, because there's a moment where the Medici become boring and you're like, no, I've got an idea for what you could do with them. And so you want to drag them off in some other direction. And so then, that's where, suddenly I have the de Reguli family instead running the Reguli Bank. And what they do is entirely, within, I can draw from history, but I'm not trapped by history. And that's just a huge pleasure. And most of this book I was writing, for my own pleasure. This was a secret project, and I originally wasn't actually intending to sell it anywhere. And so it was mostly an opportunity to just do exploration, and that world felt so rich, and there were so many pieces and parts that I could play with, but then also adapt to my own purposes. So at some point, like, you end up writing like myths or legends or songs or children's rhymes, or like you start making up your own language, and all of that was just part of the creative, I don't know, joy of it. And if it inspires people to connect back to all of that historical space, whether it's historical fiction or the actual history of that time, it's fascinating stuff. But for me, it was just a playground for me to roam through and steal from at will.
Okay, we've only got 7 minutes left. It's gone fast. I've got one question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask each of you one question real fast about future, because otherwise we're never going to leave, which might be fun and people might stick around for it, but we're not allowed. Question that got asked was from somebody who's a big fan of audiobooks, and yeah, me too. And have any of you listened to the audio versions of your books? And do you think that audiobooks bring any new dimension or interpretation of your work? Paolo, you look like you want to start. I see the mouth moving like.
If a book is read with sensitivity, and engagement, I think that there's a lot that can be brought out, particularly with first person tellings. There's a lot that can be brought out and enlivened and richened. I think that a lot of audio, unfortunately, you don't have control over the reader, or you don't have control over the way the production goes, and that can produce the opposite effect. And that's frustrating, especially when you have the words in your head and you're hoping for something great, but who knows what's going to happen on the far end.
I personally love audiobooks. I work full time and also write, so I listen to a lot of audiobooks just while I'm grocery shopping, driving, etc. And I think they give an intimacy to the novel where it almost feels like storytelling. And especially when the audiobook narrator is chosen with care, I think they can do an amazing job reinvigorating the story in a new way. I've gotten really lucky with all my narrators. So for An Echo in the City, the narrators can speak English, Cantonese, and Mandarin Chinese. And for this one, it's narrated by Natalie Nadas, who does such a fantastic job with narration. It was so cringe, but they asked me to record all the Chinese words in the book. And I was listening to my own recording and thinking, I am so glad I'm not doing this narration.
Yeah, that's the moment sorry. I absolutely dread every time I get asked the question to like record the names or like the places in the book, and I'm like, oh my God, like I have the phobia of hearing my own voice, so that's like the worst part of the publishing process for me.
So I can get this last question out, and so that I can let Mateo go first once. Um, what happens next? Either with this book, since a lot of these are projected series, but not all of them, or what are you working on next?
Yeah, so this book comes out July 9th, and I'm working on another book, and we're working on trying to bring my first to a tiny screen near you. And aside from that, I just got an air fryer. So I'm trying to air fry up some food rather than ordering dinner via Grubhub every night. So I got high blood pressure, or I'm primed for it. So we got to cut down on that sodium.
KX, I'm just going to go around.
This book, The Night Ends with Fire, is part of a duology. So I'm currently working on book 2 that's coming out in 2025. Fingers crossed.
Ava?
Yeah, Lady Macbeth is a standalone, obviously, so I'm actually going back to YA for 2025. And I have 2 YA books out in 25. The first one is a complete departure for me. It's a sapphic dystopian romance, kind of like in the vein of like the classic 2010s dystopian YA, which is like those are the books that I like grew up reading. So yeah, being on a panel with Paolo is kind of like a surreal moment for me. And I wanted to say something earlier, but I didn't want to be weird about it. But yeah, I love Shipbreaker. Um, so yeah, it's called Fable for the End of the World, and it's out in March, and I'm very excited about it.
Olivia?
I'm currently working on the sequel to Fear the Flames. So Fear the Flame comes out in September, and then Wrath of the Dragons comes out in 2025. And then I have 2 more books in the series planned after that.
Thank you, because that was a question I was wondering. Paolo?
Yeah, I'm actually working on a direct sequel to Navola, and this is the first time I've actually done something where the story directly keeps going. So it's a new experience for me. But originally, this story it grew so much that it became multi-volume. And when I realized that, I sort of shaved a piece of it off and made that the first book. But there's a huge amount of remaining material and more to Daviko's story that I'm going to be telling, and I'm not actually sure how many books that's going to be. I thought it was only going to be, originally I thought it was a short story, then it was a novel, now it's at least a couple. It just keeps, it's metastasizing. So that's what I'm doing for the near future.
Wow. Terrific. And we're going to stop here because otherwise we will be here all afternoon. We might actually have an audience for it, but they won't let us do that. So I want to thank everybody. This has been absolutely fantastic. You guys have all been terrific, and I loved all of your books, and I'm reviewing 2 of them for Library Journal in the months ahead. And I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank all the librarians and educators who joined us this afternoon. Coming up after us, there are 2 concurrent panels, Personal Stories and What Lies Beneath. And this is Marlene Harris signing off from Magic, Myth, and More. And I hope that this discussion, which it looks like from the chat, has given everybody many more magical books to read. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.